Now, when we think of classical music, we think of people like Bach, Beethoven, Brahms, Mozart, Schubert, Chopin, Stravinsky, Mahler, all who lived many years ago before our time and had the genius to create the sort of musical works that are still talked about today. Tchaikovsky is among these famous people. Chances are you may have heard his music on many occasions without knowing who wrote it. In fact, it has found its way into American cinema over the years, notably animation. For instance, Walt Disney himself once selected Tchaikovsky's famous Nutcracker suite for a hauntingly gorgeous and memorable sequence for his 1940 animated spectacular, Fantasia. 19 years later, Disney would once again use the composer's music for a similar ambitious feature, Sleeping Beauty. Tchaikovsky's ballet score proved to be a natural fit for this retelling of the classic fairy tale. And of course, the famous waltz was molded into this memorable song. I know you, I walked with you once upon a dream. Even some other animated productions have found opportunities to use Tchaikovsky's works. For instance, his romantic Romeo and Juliet overture, mostly for humorous effect. A lot of these clips that I've shown you thus far come from productions here in America, which most animation buffs like myself are familiar with. What isn't widely known is that Tchaikovsky's music can also be heard in Japanese animated productions too. For the next hour, we invite you to join us as we take a look at some of these works, which is why tonight's panel is called Tchaikovsky in Anime. So where do we go from here? Well, perhaps the best place to start is to get to know a bit more about this legendary composer. Pyotr Ilyich Tchaikovsky was born on May 7, 1840, in the Russian Empire. During his life, he has composed 7 symphonies, 11 operas, 5 suites, 3 piano concertos, 11 overtures, and of course the 3 ballets that we just talked about. His work has a distinctive style which sets it apart from other Russian composers at the time. That said, back then, Tchaikovsky's music was not always unanimously appreciated. Reportedly, the critics were very divided over his music, in part because, in their eyes, it did not seem to represent the musical values of his home country. Sometimes even the composer himself has said to be critical of his own work. Despite this, Tchaikovsky's music has still managed to appeal to audiences even outside of Russia. Today, his music has a huge following and is still performed in concerts, even long after his death at the age of 53. As mentioned before, Tchaikovsky's music has sometimes found its way outside the concert halls into several productions: radio, television, cinema, and yes, animation. Tonight, we're going to be looking at 3 Japanese animated features which use Tchaikovsky's music, mostly from his ballets. The first of these productions is this rather eccentric but charming 1979 production, Nutcracker Fantasy. But before we get into this movie, here's some interesting facts about the ballet it partially takes its inspiration from. The Nutcracker was the last ballet that Tchaikovsky worked on, as well as one of his latter-day compositions. It was first performed at the Imperial Mariinsky Theater in St. Petersburg, Russia, on December 18, 1892, about a year before the composer's death. Despite being a popular favorite at the holiday seasons nowadays, however, the Nutcracker was, according to reports, not a major success in its first performance. Nor was Tchaikovsky particularly proud of it. In fact, he was said to have detested it. The ballet is based on a fairy tale written by German author E.T.A. Hoffmann, The Nutcracker and the Mouse King. The book was once translated into English with illustrations by popular children's author Maurice Sendak. Mr. Hoffman's tale is darker and rather graphic compared to the ballet, with a backstory on how the Nutcracker came to be, subtitled The Story of the Hard Nut. Tchaikovsky initially accepted the assignment to work on this ballet on account of reportedly being a fan of the Hoffman story. But as it turned out, the libretto he was assigned to set his music to is sourced from a retelling of Hoffman's story, as penned by Alexandre Dumas, author of books like The Three Musketeers and The Count of Monte Cristo. This retelling tones down the grim aspects of the original and is the version that audiences are familiar with today. Tchaikovsky was not alone in expressing misgivings about this revised libretto. Even critics at the time of the premiere, according to reports, found the libretto to be lopsided. The music, however, proved to be much more popular than the ballet at the time. Tchaikovsky prepared a concert suite featuring selections from the Nutcracker, and it has enjoyed great success, despite Tchaikovsky's supposed resentment toward the work. But it wasn't until the 1960s that the Nutcracker finally achieved popularity, and as mentioned, it continues to be performed annually during the Christmas season, particularly in North America. As far as animated adaptations of the Nutcracker go, sometimes there have been certain episodes from popular television series which use elements or characters from the story. However, in 1990, Canadian animation studio Lacewood Productions attempted an animated feature, The Nutcracker Prince, which is based on Hoffman's book. It even retells the Hard Nuts story with a comical and cartoonish style. The rest of the movie is played straight like something you would expect from Disney. Which brings us to Nutcracker Fantasy, known in Japan as simply, and rather interestingly, The Nutcracker. This movie is not what you would expect. For one thing, there's no mention of Christmas in this tale, nor are there any sugar plum fairies to be found. This is its own version, based partially on the book by E.T.A. Hoffman, but it tells a version that audiences have never seen before, and probably never will again. Nutcracker Fantasy begins ominously on a dark, starry night when a shadowy figure known as the Ragman stalks the streets of Minden, Germany for any sign of children. For if any child happens to still be awake past bedtime, watch out! This will happen! This opening sequence has scared the bejesus out of many children upon happening to view it on TV. I should know because I was one of those children. I first saw this movie on the Disney Channel of all places, back when I was young. Anyway, to get back to the story, our heroine, young Clara, is visiting her eccentric but kind uncle, a clockmaker named Drosselmeyer. She discovers that he is carrying a nutcracker in his bag and insists on keeping it, despite her uncle's apparent reservations.
Well, I'm glad you like what I made. As you see, there are still many things that are wrong with it.
In the middle of the night, Clara wakes up to see her doll being stolen by mice. She chases them downstairs to the living room, only to find herself face to face with a fearsome two-headed mouse queen.
Well, hello. My goodness, what a lovely little doll you have there. Now, if you just give it to us, we'll be on our way. What are we waiting for? Grab the girl and steal the doll!
During this, Clara gets hurt and passes out. But then, her nutcracker springs to life and fights off the mice. But luckily, this is only just a dream. Or is it?
Was it? Could it all have been real?
At this point, Nutcracker Fantasy takes a strange, trippy turn as we follow Clara on a bizarre journey in search of her missing doll. She climbs into Drosselmeyer's great-grandfather clock and soon finds herself in a strange kingdom populated by puppets she has received from Drosselmeyer. Exploring, she discovers a hideous sleeping mouse in a bedchamber, who happens to be Princess Mary under the spell of the evil Mouse Queen. And Mary's father, the king, is quite heartbroken about this. Clara decides to take the situation into her hands by paying a visit to a gypsy fortune teller, who informs her that the spell can be broken only by destroying the Mouse Queen's source of power, the Shell of Darkness, Krakatuk. Franz, captain of the guard, who bears a resemblance to Clara's friend Fritz, leads an attack on the Mouse Queen's hideout and succeeds. But not before the vicious queen curses him to be a nutcracker. Princess Mary is restored to normal, but shows no gratitude to her transformed rescuer.
He's just a piece of wood. If you want him, take him. I'm way too pretty to marry that.
Now it's up to Clara to find a way to break Franz's curse, all while being pursued by the Mouse Queen's vengeful son.
Franz must die!
Ah!
He will die!
As you can tell by the synopsis, Nutcracker Fantasy is quite unusual with its presentation. The film was produced by a studio that would seem the least likely to attempt such a venture, Sanrio, the company behind Hello Kitty. As you may have noticed, too, the film is animated in a different style than you might expect from traditional hand-drawn animation or today's computer animation. It's called stop-motion animation, known in Japan as animagic. In case you don't know what the process is like, here's an explanation. Now for this, I'm going to partially use some clips from a video about a similar stop-motion production based on the famous children's book, Frog and Toad Are Friends. First, the puppets are crafted. These characters range in height from about 6 to 12 inches tall, depending on their proportions. Then a small set is constructed just the right size for them to perform in. To complete a sequence in which a character is talking or moving, the animator sets the puppet into position. Then the camera captures the image by a frame, sometimes more than one, depending on the circumstances. For the next shot, the animator moves the character slightly, and the cycle starts all over again. As you can tell, this process takes hours and hours and hours of work. Sometimes completing a scene which lasts about 5 seconds requires a whole day's worth of work to complete. A whole day!
Whoa!
Nutcracker Fantasy's aesthetic also bears a striking similarity to some Rankin Bass holiday specials you might have been fortunate to see on television. A lot of these productions were common in the 1960s and 1970s. As a matter of fact, Nutcracker Fantasy's director once worked as an animator on one of these projects, Santa Claus is Coming to Town. Takeo Nakamura is the former animator turned director in question. He joined Sanrio in 1975, using the experience he had gained from working on the aforementioned film to bring Nutcracker Fantasy to life. Because of the painstaking and meticulous attention to detail required in making a stop-motion feature, the production required a staff of approximately 150 people to work on. As such, Nutcracker Fantasy took 4 years to complete. The film's elaborate cast of puppet characters were photographed at MOM Studios, the same facility who produced the aforementioned Rankin Bass specials. The person who founded the studio was the late Tadahito Mochinaga, who was a pioneer of stop-motion animation in his time, which explains why this movie shares the same style as the Rankin Bass features. Because Nutcracker Fantasy was produced at a time without the use of computers, its special effects had to be produced optically or with other old-fashioned techniques. At 2 points in the movie, there are live-action ballet sequences, which provide Nutcracker Fantasy with an even more bizarre quality. How does this movie use Tchaikovsky's music? Well, it does so in ways which, like the film, are best described as uncanny. Although it does on occasion use selections from the ballet score, there are occasional embellishments and rearrangements. For instance, the famous overture from the Nutcracker ballet starts off traditionally, but then, about midway through, this happens. At another point, one of its musical selections is turned into a song, just like what happened in Sleeping Beauty.
Where does the bluebird fly? Does he have a home in the sky? Oh.
One of the film's most inspired moments is a sequence in which Clara and Franz journey to a fantastical realm in which sprites and cute creatures come to life in a glorious megamix of various melodies from the ballet. And yes, there's a Hello Kitty cameo during this scene. Aside from these, most of the film's music, provided by Akihito Wakatsuki and Kentaro Haneda, provides original melodies of its own, ranging from the heartwarming to the spooky. Nutcracker Fantasy was released in Japan on March 3, 1979. It would make a brief theatrical showing in America 4 months later that same year. For the American release, a host of recognizable names were brought in to provide the voices for the characters, sort of a precursor to the Studio Ghibli dubs. Most memorably, horror legend Christopher Lee lent his smooth baritone to Drosselmeyer. In addition, Mr. Lee portrays different characters in the film with various accents.
Ah, what a cute little nutcracker. It's under a spell, isn't it? A nasty spell. Your heart must know. Know that your love is very real and true.
He even gets to sing.
In your heart of hearts lives a light, and it shines only for you.
As mentioned, this version of Nutcracker Fantasy was released briefly to theaters and then to video. On occasion, it has been shown on television, but has been rarely seen by many. Interestingly, the original Japanese version of Nutcracker Fantasy is notably longer than the American cut by approximately 14 minutes. Here, scenes are extended.
No, he's got the sword of pearls!
There are also some interesting naming differences between certain characters. Some of the scenes which didn't make it into the American cut of Nutcracker Fantasy are also some of the film's most fascinating. Let's have a look at some of these deleted scenes. For instance, after Clara ventures into Drosselmeyer's clock, she briefly finds herself face to face with a scary apparition of the Ragman from the beginning of the movie. The Land of Happy Times dance scene is also longer and features some additional characters, such as these dancing donuts. and even a clown every bit as creepy as Pennywise from Stephen King's It. There is also an imaginative sequence set to Waltz of the Flowers, which also is nowhere to be found in the American release. Nutcracker Fantasy has been out of print for many years, but thankfully, the folks at Discotheque Media have brought this oddity back into print. Their Blu-ray release features both cuts so that you can decide for yourself which version plays best, and in my opinion, they did a phenomenal job remastering it. I highly recommend checking it out if you like stop-motion animation and classical music in general. Interestingly, the film was reissued in Japan in 2014 for a 3D version with all new visual effects. But this version also makes some omissions from the original. The live-action ballet sequences are replaced with something else, and the entire soundtrack is re-recorded. Whether that's a good or bad thing is up to the viewer. Luckily, the original version is the one that Discotheque Media has rescued. The next film on our showcase is a similarly rare production which also has a small following of fans. It happened to release 2 years after Nutcracker Fantasy in Japan. It is known simply as Swan Lake, which is a traditional animated feature, 74 minutes in length. And yes, it's based on the ballet of the same name. Once again, here's a brief history of the musical work in question before we go into the film. Swan Lake was Tchaikovsky's first ballet, and today it is one of the most widely performed ballets of all time, which is why it's hard to imagine that the ballet was actually a failure in its first performance in 1877. A failure! But it was, believe it or not. And Tchaikovsky sadly never lived to see Swan Lake find its audience over time. The composer would only find genuine success at ballet in his lifetime with his subsequent effort, Sleeping Beauty. Unlike either that ballet or the Nutcracker, though, Swan Lake is not based on any existing fairy tale. In fact, no record exists to prove who wrote the libretto for the ballet, much less where the idea for the plot came from. Many people who have seen the ballet are familiar with its storyline, but for those of you who are not, it goes something like this. Once upon a time, young Prince Siegfried finds himself intrigued by a most unusual swan. She turns out to be the fair Princess Odette, who is under the spell of the evil magician Rothbart. By the terms of the curse, Odette can only resume her human form at night. True love is the one thing that can break her spell. Siegfried, in love, invites Odette to come to his castle the following evening, where a ball will be held in celebration of his 21st year. There he will choose her to be his bride. Odette makes no guarantees that she will be able to come. On the night of the ball, a woman in a dark dress shows up, bearing a strange resemblance to Odette, and the prince is attracted to her. But she turns out to be Odile, Rothbart's only daughter. The prince doesn't make the connection until it's too late. At this point, various productions of the ballet differ in terms of how it chooses to resolve this story. In one ending, Siegfried fights Rothbart, defeats him, breaks the spell, and he and Odette live happily ever after. Other resolutions are far more tragic. Some productions have Odette and Siegfried both commit suicide, which causes Rothbart to both lose his powers and his life. This ending also concludes with the doomed lovers ascending to the heavens. Others have Siegfried or Odette die, leaving the other heartbroken, with the spell permanently unbroken. Still others have Rothbart succeed in claiming Odette for himself, leaving the prince downcast. Which brings us to this version. It happens to be the first of its kind to set this story to animation. Don't confuse this movie for the animated feature, The Swan Princess. Swan Lake, as produced by Toei Animation Studios, is a different kind of bird altogether. For one thing, it's a much more somber tale, and it also, rather appropriately, uses Tchaikovsky's music from the ballet. Little is known about the actual production behind this movie, so at this point, I might as well provide some background information about the studio behind this feature. Toei Animation was, in the 1960s, Japan's biggest animation facility, long before Studio Ghibli. In fact, a certain animator named Hayao Miyazaki found his first job right here. One of the projects he worked on was another fairy tale feature, 1969's The Wonderful World of Puss in Boots, which became Toei's most popular animated movie at the time. In fact, the main character, the crafty cat Pero, became Toei's official mascot. The Wonderful World of Puss in Boots was directed by Kimio Yabuki. Mr. Yabuki has directed numerous other films at Toei Animation Studios. Swan Lake happens to be one of them. So how did Toei handle the story for Swan Lake? The answer, relatively faithfully, with some occasional twists. For instance, two squirrels, Hans and Margarita, serve as both comic relief and as the audience's eye into the story.
Farewell, my prince. You'll never know how much I loved you.
Well, if you need some help getting up from there, you can just call your prince.
But these two aren't just there to pander to the kids. They participate in much of the film's action and help out Odette and Siegfried whenever they can.
If you're saying that you're afraid to go into the forest, then you can forget all about marrying me, because I'm not going to marry a coward.
All right. Don't get so upset. I'm going.
I'm so proud of you.
Will you be proud of me when I'm dead? Oh.
Siegfried is portrayed pretty much as you'd expect. Young, inexperienced, and naive to a fault.
If you'd looked into her eyes the way I have, Benno, you'd know that she could never break a promise to anyone. Never. She'll be here, Benno. And the minute that I am king, she'll be my queen. You'll see.
And Odette, of course, is as vulnerable as she is strong, internally.
If you loved me as much as you say you do, you wouldn't have done anything to make me so unhappy.
In the ballet, the evil Rothbart is commonly portrayed as an owl-like figure. In this version, Rothbart on occasion takes the form of an owl, but otherwise comes across as a comic villain and not particularly scary.
Oh, my precious Odette, say that you'll marry me and I'll give you the most beautiful things in the world. Why, if you marry me, I'll give you more money for clothes than you could spend in a lifetime.
If anything, his daughter Odile is even more villainous.
She dares to break my heart.
Why not kill her?
What?
That would solve all your problems. You can't wait forever, and she'll never say yes, so you might as well get rid of her now.
Even so, Rothbart still gets to have his moments of true menace.
If you don't do what I say, I'll turn you into a caterpillar, Odette. Just watch me.
Oh, no!
Because Swan Lake carries a heavy emphasis on story, dance sequences are kept to a minimum in this film. In fact, there are 4 such moments altogether. First is this imaginary dream scene. Then there is this. And of course, the grand ball. But perhaps the closest this movie gets to recapturing the ballet experience is a scene approximately midway through the film involving some recently hatched ducklings performing one of the ballet's most memorable set pieces, Dance of the Seven Swans. As for the ending, Toei takes elements from various productions and forges its own identity. After realizing his mistake, Siegfried pursues the wicked Rothbart to his castle, and they engage in a vicious duel. It all boils down to Rothbart forcing Odette to make a terrible choice.
Will you love me forever, or will you let Siegfried die like a rat?
Odette, let him kill me! My life doesn't matter!
Give me your answer, Odette. I'm waiting.
I promise that I will love you, Rothbart, for the rest of my life.
No, Odette! Ah!
No, you will not.
As grim as this seems, there's no need to worry. This version has a happy ending.
Siegfried.
Odette.
See? What did I tell you? And even better, Hans and Margarita resolve their relationship. Swan Lake was released in Japan on March 14, 1981, and would eventually go on to win an award at the 1981 Moscow Film Festival. Its release in America, on the other hand, is a rather curious situation. You see, this film happens to have two different English versions, both made sometime around the 1980s. The first dub was recorded by a Tokyo-based company called Frontier Enterprises, written and directed by its founder, William Ross. The cast consists of names you probably might not recognize. But anyway, here's a sample of what it sounds like.
How gallant and dignified. So different from Hans.
Oh, stop comparing me with Prince Siegfried. Just tell me when you will become my bride.
Don't talk nonsense. I wouldn't marry you.
What's that? A swan wearing a crown on its head?
A very curious bird.
Let me take care of Rothbard.
Please wait, Prince Siegfried.
Don't stop me. I must release Adolf from the spell.
No, Rothbard could never be harmed by any ordinary human being.
How do you know he can't be harmed?
We tried to fight against Rothbard.
Don't tell me that this someone you love and wish to live with is Siegfried.
Don't you think it's a good idea?
No, that's something I can't do. I could never kill my beautiful and precious little Odette.
Oh, you're so soft-hearted. Then if you can't do it, I don't mind doing it for you.
No, don't do it, Odile. Don't do it. I'm too much in love with Odette. I love her so much.
Oh, no, you must be Rothbard.
That is correct. And now Princess Odette belongs to me.
Odette? Then who are you?
I told you that my name was Odile.
Around that same period, a second English dub was commissioned by the Samuel Goldwyn Company of all studios. Their version, like Nutcracker Fantasy, uses recognizable names to provide the principal voices. This second dub was recorded by another unknown studio, Golden Sync, handled by actor-writer Artwright Chamberlain. The rest of the characters are portrayed by names that have other significant voice acting careers. And this is the result.
Oh, Prince, you're so wonderful. Not like that stupid Hans.
Will you please stop comparing me to him? And hey, by the way, when are you going to marry me anyway?
Oh, don't be silly. I'd never marry you.
Oh, would you look at that? A swan with a crown on its head. Well, blow me down.
I'll show that Rothbard a thing or two.
No, you mustn't go into the castle.
Don't try and stop me. I must save my friend from that evil spell.
Do you honestly think that you could hurt Rothbard with that tiny little sword of yours?
And what makes you so certain that I couldn't?
He tried to fight against Rothbard.
So, it's that puny little Prince Siegfried you're in love with, isn't it?
A good idea, don't you think?
Well, that's something I could never do, never in a million years. I could never do anything to hurt my beautiful Odette.
Oh, how did you get to be such a softy? If you don't have the guts to do it, I'll do it for you.
No! And please put that horrible thought out of your mind. I love her too much, Odile. Please.
You must be that evil sorcerer Rothbard.
Very smart. Now Odette belongs to me.
But if that's Princess Odette, who did I just propose to?
Well, I told you my name was Odile, didn't I?
Swan Lake would eventually be released on video here in America. Naturally, you would expect that the version with the bigger names would be the version that viewers would find on the shelves of retailers. Instead, rather bizarrely, the Frontier dub was the version released to video. The Golden Sync dub, meanwhile, had occasional screenings on television. In fact, I once saw it air on the Disney Channel. As someone who owned the video at the time, I was quite surprised at how different the voices sounded, as I'm sure anyone in that same situation would. Why this situation happened is hard to explain. Recently, Swan Lake was released on DVD by Discotheque Media, and it features both dubs, although it should be known that the Golden Sync dub has some sound quality issues, so I had to use a cleaner sounding source for this presentation. The Japanese version is on this release too, and thankfully, there are no cuts in any of the versions. Whichever one plays best is ultimately up to the viewer. While there have been other adaptations of Swan Lake in animation since this one, Toei's version is still very much deserving of a second look, especially if you're a fan of the ballet. The third and final film on our showcase is yet another one you may not recognize, but it too uses Tchaikovsky's music, at least briefly. A Journey Through Fairyland, known in Japan as Fairy Florence, is anime's answer to Fantasia. As with Walt Disney's now famous masterpiece, this film, released in Japan on October 19, 1985, is a collage of different pieces of music from a host of famous composers such as Strauss, Chopin, Bach, Beethoven, Mozart, and many others. And yes, Tchaikovsky is one of them. Unlike Fantasia, however, this film does attempt to provide a plot of some kind. A Journey Through Fairyland tells the story of a boy named Michael who aspires to be a great musician. Unfortunately, he tends to spend more time tending to his personal garden, to the point that he shows up late for practice, and worse yet, screws up. Case in point. Naturally, this doesn't please his music teacher one bit.
I don't think Beethoven wrote that part.
Soon it becomes clear that Michael will have to be sent home from his music school. But just as he is saying goodbye to his flowers, a beautiful fairy named Florence appears and whisks our hero away on a strange journey through a bizarre and colorful world. At this point, the film simply becomes an excuse to show off spectacularly beautiful animation, trippy visuals, and of course, listen to glorious music. All throughout 91 minutes. And yes, there is yet another Hello Kitty tribute. A Journey Through Fairyland, like Nutcracker Fantasy, was produced at Sanrio Studios, and it took 4 years to complete. The film is directed by Masami Hata, who has helmed other notable features, such as Sea Prince and the Fire Child, Legend of Sirius in Japanese, Little Nemo, Adventures in Slumberland, and the seemingly cuddly but ultimately depressing Ringing Bell. Sadly, for Sanrio, this would be their last animated production for a long time. Because of its massive budget, the film failed to break even in its theatrical release. In fact, it would not be until 12 years after this movie that the company would try again with animated features. In between, they would only produce short films as well as direct-to-video or television series based on their characters. A Journey Through Fairyland has never achieved the same sort of cult status that Nutcracker Fantasy or Swan Lake have gradually gone on to achieve. But this movie still has its share of breathtaking scenes. One of them involves Tchaikovsky's own Waltz of the Flowers from the Nutcracker, which unsurprisingly is reminiscent of Fantasia. A Journey Through Fairyland was released in America in 1995 by Celebrity Home Entertainment under the brand Just for Kids. The English cast does not feature any recognizable names. It also has narration nowhere to be found in the Japanese version.
And so Michael ran off for his class at the Music Institute where he lived. Michael was late again, as usual. When he got to orchestra rehearsal, all the other students were already tuning up their instruments. And the next thing he knew, Michael was off on the most incredible adventure of his life.
Discotheque Media offers both this dub and the Japanese version on DVD, so that viewers can decide for themselves which plays best. Aside from these 3 movies, there have been some other occasions where Tchaikovsky's music has found its way into a Japanese production. For instance, this whimsical TV series, Princess Tutu, mixes elements from the Nutcracker, Swan Lake, and Sleeping Beauty into a lively concoction underscored by all sorts of classical music, and yes, that includes Tchaikovsky's famous 3 ballets. It's currently available from Sentai Filmworks. Even Japanese video games have used, on occasion, music from Tchaikovsky. For example, 2 Final Fantasy games. Also, in this Kingdom Hearts game, Dream Drop Distance, there is a stage based on the Nutcracker Suite sequence from Fantasia. Even this lesser-known title, Pandora's Tower, includes one of Tchaikovsky's compositions into its soundtrack. The music you are hearing is that of his final symphony, Pathétique.
I've never eaten meat.
Well, if you don't eat it, your fate will be sealed. You'll grow more and more monstrous. And there'll be no happy ending for you and young Aaron.
The greatest thing about Tchaikovsky's music is that no matter where you manage to catch one of his melodies, whether you're at a concert hall, listening to the radio, watching a movie or TV show, or wherever, it's always a pleasure to listen to any of his compositions. That they still live on long after his time is a testament to his genius as a composer. As someone who was introduced to Tchaikovsky as a child, I still have a fondness for this man's work, and have found it fascinating how several productions have found ways to incorporate his music. Some of these productions are less widely known than others, but even so, it's nice to give such productions a shout-out as well. And I wanted to do just that in this presentation. And speaking of which, we've come to the end of tonight's show. I hope you enjoyed it and found it interesting, and I have several other panels planned for the rest of the year, and they'll all be premiering right here on Virtual Panel Theater. Keep your eye open for them. But they'll also be available on my Facebook page if you would rather view them on there. And someday, when cons start again, maybe I'll be able to present them to you in person someday. But until then, this is John Turner saying, stay safe everyone, thanks for coming, and I'll see you next time. Goodbye for now.